In October 1941, deep in the mud and encroaching chill before Moscow, Colonel General Heinz Guderian, the architect of the German Blitzkrieg and the father of the Panzer Arm, stood before something that should not exist. This was not a paper report but a crude, battle-scarred trophy, a captured Soviet tank. But it was not one of the flimsy, awkward machines his panzers had been cracking open like nuts since June. This was a ghost made steel, a nightmare materialized from the terrified reports of his tank crews. The memorandum he would send to Berlin would be dry and factual, but its subtext would scream of impending catastrophe. It didn't describe a new secret weapon or a hidden army. It described a tank, the T-34, whose design was so brutally revolutionary, its potential so horrifying, that to the men of the German High Command, it seemed impossible. A joke, a product of Slavic inferiority incapable of true innovation. But to Guderian and his men, whose shells were bouncing off its sloped armor like pebbles, it was something else entirely. It was a death sentence cast in iron. It was the day they knew, with chilling certainty, that this war would not be a parade. This is the story of the devastating truth that was too terrifying for Adolf Hitler to believe, and how the denial of a single engineering fact sealed the fate of the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. In the heart of the Nazi war machine, an unshakable faith in its own technological supremacy reigned. In the summer of 1941, that faith seemed divinely justified. The Wehrmacht, drunk on the easy victories in Poland and France, was considered invincible. Its spearhead was the Panzerwaffe, the elite of the elite. German engineering, embodied in the Panzer III and Panzer IV, was seen as the pinnacle of global tank design. They were sophisticated, precise instruments, crafted in the finest factories of Europe by the world's best engineers. Nazi propaganda trumpeted the invincibility of Aryan genius, while portraying the Slavic Untermenschen of the East as a primitive horde, capable only of producing crude copies of outdated Western designs. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was planned as a swift campaign to be concluded before the first winter snows. Into this echo chamber of self-congratulation roared the sound of the T-34's wide tracks. The first encounters were a shock so profound they defied adequate description in staff reports. The Wehrmacht's standard 37 anti-tank gun, which soldiers had nicknamed the Herasanklopfgerät, the Army's door knocker, was utterly useless against it. Its shells shattered or ricocheted wildly off the T-34's hull. Panzer crews watched in horror as their best armor-piercing rounds, fired at point-blank range, left little more than scorched gouges on the Soviet tank's hide. "We fired until our barrels glowed," one German officer wrote, but to no effect. It drove through our positions like a giant, invulnerable rhinoceros. What was its secret? In Berlin, engineers and strategists studying the initial intelligence couldn't fathom it. The answer lay in a revolutionary design philosophy that the German school, obsessed with complexity and perfection, had simply missed. First was the sloped armor. Designer Mikhail Koshkin's team had applied a simple principle of physics. A shell striking armor at an angle must penetrate a much greater effective thickness and is far more likely to be deflected. The S-45 frontal plate, sloped at 60 degrees, offered the same protection as nearly 90 of vertical armor, making it impervious to the vast majority of German tank and anti-tank guns of 1941. Second were its wide tracks. While the elegant German panzers with their narrow tracks bogged down in the thick Russian mud, the dreaded Rasputitsa, and later froze solid in the winter, the T-34 with its wide footprint seemed to float over the terrain. Third was its V2 diesel engine. Unlike the gasoline engines of the German tanks, it was less prone to catching fire and offered superior torque and a far greater operational range, a critical advantage in the vast expanses of Russia. But for the Nazi worldview, the most insulting feature was the tank's brilliant simplicity. Inside, the T-34 was Spartan, even crude. The welds on its armor plates were rough and uneven. Its optics were primitive by German standards. It lacked the finely machined elegance that German engineers prided themselves on, and that was precisely its most devastating weapon. The T-34 was not designed for crew comfort or aesthetic perfection. It was designed for mass production. It was designed to be built quickly, by a workforce that was not highly skilled, on machinery that was not state-of-the-art. It was a tank for a total war of attrition. Guderian, along with other frontline commanders, understood this instantly. He urgently demanded a commission be sent to the front to study the T-34 and made a proposal that was considered heresy in Berlin: copy it, bolt for bolt, as quickly as possible. The material superiority of our panzer forces, which had been taken for granted until now, was lost, he wrote. But in the Führer's headquarters, far from the blood and mud of the East, a different reality held sway. Guderian's reports were met with skepticism and irritation. How could primitive Slavs create a better tank than the Herrenfolk, the master race? It was an ideological impossibility. Hitler and his inner circle dismissed the warnings. These must be isolated prototypes, they argued. The Soviets could never mass-produce such a machine. It must be the work of captured American or British engineers. Any explanation was preferable to admitting the horrifying truth. The enemy they deemed subhuman had outclassed them in the single most important technology of land warfare. The wall of ideological denial proved stronger than any tank's armor. Meanwhile, beyond the Ural Mountains, an industrial miracle born of desperation was unfolding. As the Wehrmacht drove deeper into the country, Stalin ordered the evacuation of entire factories to the east. The Kharkov Locomotive Factory No. 183, the birthplace of the T-34, was disassembled, loaded onto over 1,000 trains, and shipped to Nizhny Tagil in the Urals. There, in inhuman conditions, under open skis in the brutal winter, workers, now mostly women and teenagers, reassembled the production lines. Their motto was a concept the Nazi leadership could not comprehend: everything for the front, everything for victory. The production philosophy was ruthless and pragmatic. If a part worked, it was fitted, regardless of its finish. Quality control was reduced to the bare essentials. Does it drive and does it shoot? Send it to the front. It was the antithesis of the German approach, with its long development cycles, obsession with precision, and exacting quality standards for every component. As a result, while the German industrial machine struggled to produce hundreds of its technically superb but temperamental panzers, the Soviet factories in Tankograd began to spew forth thousands upon thousands of T-34s. It was a torrent of steel that could not be stopped. It was the victory of a production ideology. The Soviet Union countered German quality with crushing quantity, and that quantity became a quality all its own. The consequences of Berlin's denial were written in blood on the snows outside Moscow in the winter of 1941–42. The German offensive, Operation Typhoon, ground to a halt. Panzers froze solid, their crews dying from frostbite, while across the frozen fields, relentless and terrifying, the T-34s led the great Soviet counteroffensive. Only then did the High Command begin to grasp the scale of the catastrophe. A frantic effort to design an answer began. The result was the Tiger and the Panther, magnificent machines, technically superior to the T-34 in almost every way. But they were too complex, too expensive, and far too few. They were too late. The ultimate showdown came at the Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943. It was a clash of philosophies. Germany's elite panzer divisions, equipped with their new Tigers and Panthers, met the Soviet tank armies, whose backbone was the upgraded T-34-85, now mounting a more powerful cannon. For every Tiger the Germans fielded, the Soviets had 10 T-34s. The Germans inflicted staggering losses, but the attrition arithmetic was grimly simple. For every elite Tiger lost, a replacement was months away. For every 10 T-34s knocked out, 20 more were rolling off the assembly lines. The Wehrmacht bled itself white at Kursk, losing the core of its veteran Panzerwaffe. It would never again mount a major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. The tide had turned for good. The steel roller of the Red Army, led by its endless columns of T-34s, began its long, grinding journey west toward Berlin. In the end, the story of the T-34 is more than a tale of a good tank. It is a chilling parable of how ideological blindness and racial arrogance lead directly to strategic ruin. The German High Command did not lose the war on the Eastern Front in 1945. They lost it in the autumn of 1941, when they chose to believe their own propaganda over the desperate reports of their best generals. They were defeated because their worldview could not accommodate the idea of Slavic ingenuity. They built their entire strategy on a foundation of prejudice, and when the steel tide of mathematical reality crashed against it, the entire structure was washed away. The T-34, with its rough welds and unrefined simplicity, became a monument to the very things Nazism sought to destroy: the power of brutal pragmatism and mass mobilization in the face of existential threat. And when, in May 1945, its descendants stood with red stars painted on their turrets amidst the rubble of the Reichstag, they were not just symbols of victory. They were the final, irrefutable proof that facts, eventually, always run over fantasy,